In this session, we'll learn how to save workbooks to roles. Now, if a user wants to save a workbook to a particular location so that the results of the query can be accessed easily by other users, then the user would need to save the workbook to a role. Now, a role here means a SAP security role. So you may want to set up roles specifically for saving workbooks. So that should be part of your security strategy, so that whenever a user wants to save and share the workbooks with other group of people, then you need to allow those such users to save the queries to roles. Now, once the workbook is saved in a role, you can then assign the role to all the group of people who need to share the workbooks. For example, if a sales manager in a particular region, and a sales manager from another region need to execute the same workbooks, then they will both have the role you created to hold the, let's say, the sales workbook, because assuming that both of them are sales manager from two different regions. Now let's say the manager is from southern region, so when he creates a new workbook, then the manager will save it to a role for the sales workbook. So this enables manager from another region, say the northern region, to execute the new workbook. Now, another strategy would be that you may allow another option would be to allow power users to save workbooks, to maintain roles, and ensure that the workbooks remain manageable. Now, this also prevents users from changing workbooks saved by other users. So let's create a role, and let's see how saving the workbook to a role can be implemented in the system. So let's create. So this is the role that we created for saving the workbook queries to workbooks. Let's go and copy this role. And save. And copy to a role. Okay, so say copy all. So because for saving the workbooks, we need the objects. So let's go and enter the authorizations. Now, to save the query to a role, to a workbook, we need access to s_GUI. And within this, for saving the workbook to a role, query to a workbook, you need access to value 60. The user would need access to value 60. But if the workbook needs to be executed, then the saved workbook, that is, then the user would also need access to 61. So let's give both of them. And then we need access to s_BD, s_DS. And this object is needed to execute the query itself. This seems to be a new requirement in BI. You don't need this object in BW, but for some reason this is needed in the BI system. So this is for executing the query itself. So, but this has nothing to do with workbook as such. To saving the queries to workbook, you need access to s_GUI and need access to s_BD, s_DS. So this is the values that SAP recommends for saving queries to workbook. So activity 0, 3 and 30, and class tab has to be OT. Now to saving the workbooks to roles, you need access to two more additional objects. So what are those two objects? The one object is s_user_agr, and the other object is s_user_tcd. So these two objects. Now this object, because we are saving the workbook to a role, this object is needed for a role check, meaning the role that we want to save the workbook to, whether the role exists or not, and whether we have the right authorizations, meaning the user has the right authorization to save the workbook to a role. So this has got two fields. One is the activity field. Let's say for this field the value you need would be 01, 02 and 22. If you want the user to allow the user to delete the workbooks, you can give 06 also. So let's save it, and in the role name field you should enter the roles or role in which you want the workbooks to be saved. So let's click on that, and then let's pick up the role that we created in the, okay, save. So let's go give let's go. Now this role, let's check whether this role exists or not. So let's go and open up another session. Go to PHCG. Z-test. BI role for workbook. Workbooks. Now let's click on change, and if the bottom of the screen says the role does not exist, so if the role does not exist, then you need to create that role. Now let's go and take a look at this object one more time again. Now for many people, as security administrators, you'll be surprised to see why the user needs access to 01, which is for create, or adding 02 for change for this object s_user_agr. Now the object s_user_agr is required so the user can save the workbook to the menu area of the role, menu area of this role. So when granting access to s_user_agr, you need to grant create and change authorizations for specific role name. So this is the role, the role name that will be used to hold the workbooks. So when the workbook is saved in a role, the area menu of this role would be change. So that's why you need this object with 01, 02 and 22 access. Now the object s_user_tcd, now this is a standard object so that which needs a value as RRMX. Now, like we said, as part of the security implementation strategy, you need to determine which group of users can save workbooks to roles, and how the roles for workbooks should be organized. So the workbook security strategy should include who will need to save workbooks and what roles will they use and how those roles will be shared. For security purposes, when you allow the users to save the workbooks to roles, it is recommended that the workbooks be refreshed when opened to ensure that data from the last execution is not displayed. So, and there is a, you can go to the Bexnalizer, and in the workbook settings, there will be an option to refresh workbook when open. So that needs to be done every time so that the data is refreshed when the workbook is opened. So let's go and now generate the role. Now this role does not exist, but because we need to save it to our the roles, we are trying to save workbooks to roles. The role in which the workbook will be saved has to exist. So this one, like we said, it doesn't exist. So we need to create one, create the role. And let's create again 2 folders for where, so that the workbooks can be organized properly. Say, no, not the transaction code, sorry. This is my mistake, not transaction. We need to create 2 folders. So you scroll up and, oops, sorry. Did that mistake again. We need to create 2 folders. Let's say US data, and scroll up again and create another folder. Say Germany data. And click save. Now this role needs to be empty. Now there is a reason why this needs to be empty that we'll see later further. But this role should not contain any authorizations. That is, the role in which the workbooks will be saved should not contain any authorizations in it. Or if you have multiple roles for saving workbooks, so then those roles should not contain any authorizations. So, but organizing the workbooks, you need to create the folders, at least 1 folder. Now this role needs to be assigned to the user who is going to save the workbook to the role, that is the power users or the managers. And this also has to be assigned to users with whom the workbook is going to be shared. So if, for example, the Southern region manager executes the query and saves it into a role, into this role, then the Southern region manager needs access to this role so that he can save the workbook. And let's say it is the Southern region manager is sharing the workbook with a Northern region manager, then the Northern region manager also needs access to this role. So this role needs to be assigned to both the users, both the managers. So let's go and assign this role to user A, and let us go and assign this to user B, because user A is going to log in and execute the query and save the workbook into a role, And then we will log in as user B and check that user B has access to the workbook. But this role, okay, this role is already X. So the role that contains the authorization to save the workbook to a role, that role also has to be assigned to the user. So user A already has it because we copied this role. So user A needs to have access to saving the workbooks to a role plus the role in which the workbook will be saved, and user B needs access to the role in which the workbook is saved. Now let us log in with user A, execute a query and save it to a role. Now before we do that, let's see what happens if we don't assign this to user A. Okay, so we'll come back and assign the roles, assign this role to user A again. Okay, so let's start that scenario first, where the workbook role is assigned to one user, but it's not assigned to the user who is going to save the workbook. That is, in our case, is user A. So let us log in with user A and see what happens, whether the user A is able to save the workbook to this role or not. Which role was this? This role. Okay, so let's log in with user A. So we logged in with the user A now, and in the externalizer, let's go and execute this query. I mean, if you go to info area and all, you can see all those info cubes and all that queries underneath that. But this info area, this query is part of that list because we have been testing this query in the previous sessions. So let's go and execute it. Okay. Okay, so let's go and check what the issue is. Let's do it again. So okay, so let's try it again. Let's try executing the query, put the technical names on, and now let's execute this query. And let's go and enter, say, 3000 as the company code and execute. So we get the results. Then let's go and format it because so let's go and save this workbook as a workbook to a role. Let's see what happens. So click on save and then save as new workbook. So let's click on the roles tab because we want to save it in the roles. Don't worry about this message not responding. It's going to work. It's going to take time. So you get a message called no entry found. The reason being, the role in which we are supposed to save the workbook, that role, that is this role, is not assigned to user A. That's why you're getting this message called no entry found. So whenever you have, when you click on the roles button and then you see no entry found, that means that the user does not have access to roles in which he can save the workbook. So let's go and add the role to the role in which the query needs to be saved to user A now, and then log in with user A again and see if this time the user can see these two, in this role. And when he sees if he finds the role, then he should be able to see these two folders. Oops. Save it. So let's log in with user A again and check it out. So we logged in with user A again. Let's put the technical names on and let's execute the same query. And let's input the same value, 3000 for US company code, and then execute it. Okay, so let's format this time again. We don't need to test it, do this for testing, but anyways. So let's change this also. And now let's go and click save as a new workbook, so that we want to save the query as a workbook and into a role, because we want to share this output with other users. So let's click on the roles button and you get to see the description of the role as the root node. And then you had those two folders within that. So you can select the folder in which you want to save the workbook and say test US data and click on save. So once you click on save, the workbook is saved into the role. Now let's go and check this role. Go out and see. Okay, not this one. Okay, what was that role? Test BI role for workbooks. So Z : test BI roles for workbooks. So we saved this query as a workbook into a role, into the US data folder. So click on the menu tab and click on the US data. So you can see the queried workbook name here. Now if you put the technical names on, okay, so that's what you get, because it can be executed through RRMX. Anyways, so this role has also been assigned to user B. So which means that when user B logs in and goes to the roles button, the user B should be able to see this query. So let's test that out now. So next, what will we do? We will log in as user B and check whether this workbook is shared with user B or not. So let's log in with user B now. So we log in with user B. When you click on the roles tab now, after logging in with user B, now we don't see any entries here. The reason being, we opened a query, not a workbook. So, and you don't see any entry because the role that gives the authorizations to save the query to a workbook to a role, that role is not assigned to user B. And we opened a query, not a workbook. That's why we are not able to see anything in the roles tab. So let's click on cancel and go open, and let's open a workbook. So now this time we should be able to see the query, so the workbook. Let's click on the roles button now. and you can see the role description of the role in which the query is saved as a workbook, and within that folder in which we save the query we have the workbook name. Now when you look at the output for when the user logs in with user B, you can see only that you see only one folder out of the query. You don't see the Germany data folder. That is because the Germany data folder doesn't contain any workbooks under it. Now, the important thing that we need to know here is that this role that we created for saving the workbooks to roles, this role needs to be assigned to both the users. I mean, the user who is going to save the query to the workbook to a role, and also to the user who is going to use the shared workbook. Now, normally these roles are created in the development system and moved to the production system. And that is where, that is the production system is the place where the users would create workbooks and save those workbooks to roles. Now, if the role was originally developed in dev, and then you make the changes to the role in development system and transport it again, what will happen is in the process you'll remove the attachments for the roles for all the workbooks that were saved to the role in production. So if you move this role, for what it means is, well, if you move this role from say development to production, and then in production system the user save the workbooks to roles, and later on in the development system you modify this role, say let's say by adding another folder called let's say Canada data, okay, and now you move this role again to production. So what will happen is this role, I mean this workbook, the workbooks that were saved to this role in the production system, it will no longer be attached to the role, but the role will still exist in the production system, but it will not contain the workbooks that were saved in that role. And as a result of that, the user will not be able to see the workbooks. Now, from a security strategy standpoint, for the roles with workbooks, it is probably best for the security administrators to create specific roles for workbooks that only contains workbooks with no authorizations. So that's why we said this role should not contain any authorizations, so that there is no chance of the workbooks getting removed. Now, any changes made to the role will be from the workbooks being created and saved in this role in the production environment. Now, this role should be created in development system and then transported to production, but it should be empty and no other subsequent transport should occur for this role. So once this role is created and originally created and transported to production, after that you should not transport this role, the role again. So that's the reason why this role should not contain any authorizations. Now you have a program, for example, called RSWB. Let's go to SA38. You have a program called RSWB underscore reorg underscore roles. Okay, this does not exist. Maybe they change the name of this role, this programs to There's a program to identify identify the workbooks that are not attached to a role. So it should be there in this list somewhere. Okay, see, this is the role. Oh, okay, that's RSWB roles reorg. So you can go and execute it, and you can search the role name or by examine all roles. This is going to be a lot of time. But anyways, there is this program, SC30, let's go to SC38 again. That is this program which can be used by you to check what workbooks are not attached to a role. And you can also use this report to delete unused workbooks. Now, to summarize, to execute a query, to save the query to a workbook in a role, you need access to these two objects, s_user_agr for saving. These two objects are needed, like I said, for saving the workbooks to roles, s_user_agr and s_user_tcd, along with s_GUI and s_bds_ds, because these two objects are needed for saving the query to a workbook, and these two objects, they are needed for saving the workbook to a role.